Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here to present to you the training module on cover crop planting and establishment. Just a little upfront on it. This was developed by Dr. Rob Myers at University of Missouri, and he's part of North Central Region SARE. And it was reviewed by Dr. Eileen Kladivko at Purdue and Dr. Paul Jassa at University of Nebraska. Anna talked about the funding. You can see all the funding there that has gone into this project, and we will take it from there. So this presentation will provide some guidance on getting cover crops established, particularly fall planted cover crops. We're going to talk about the type of seeding method used. We're going to talk about equipment options. We're going to talk about timing of seeding, interseeding options, avoiding problems with residual herbicides, and impacting survival of winter annual cover crops. So let's get started on planting method. What planting method do you want to use? Well, traditionally, most cover crop seed has been drilled or broadcast seeded. The thing to keep in mind here when we talk about planting methods is seed soil contact and moisture are probably your two most critical things. And when you look at the different type of seeding methods, some do better at getting that seed soil and moisture contact. The larger the seed is, the harder it is to get that seed soil contact. And also, you need more water to imbibe those seeds to get them to germinate. So it may be more important to rough up the soil surface or possibly roll or press the seed into the soil if you're broadcast seeding. That's one of the benefits with drilled seeding is that you put that seed into the soil. Aerial seeding works best with smaller seeds, things like radishes, clover, ryegrass, than larger seeds like Austrian winter pea. And that's because with aerial seeding, you probably are not going to have the opportunity to incorporate those into the surface. So you have to be really sensitive to that type of, those types of issues when you're broadcast seeding. Precision planters like a corn planter, they can work well for one or two species, but they're not going to work for your multi-species blends of cover crop seeds. And you know, the planting method is often going to be tied to the planting date. Some species are more important to plant early, like radishes, so you may have to interseed or aerial seed those in, or something like cereal rye is much easier to plant after the corn harvest or soybean harvest. So really, when you're looking at your planting method, you have to match it to your planting date as well as your cover crop species. We usually tell people for reliable cover crop establishment to use a grain drill. It's a preferred method for establishing cover crops as soon after harvest of the fall crop as possible. You're placing the seed in contact with soil moisture as well as soil itself, and providing that contact really increases the odds of the cover crop establishment success compared to just simply broadcasting the seed on the surface, which really relies on adequate and timely rainfall to be successful. This method is used by many farmers and is usually in surveys is indicated as the top method used for planting cover crops. Some farmers have gone to using row crop planters. There's a couple of advantages in using a row crop planter, being that you have more accuracy in the placement of the seed into the soil and its seed spacing. Because of that, that can give you lower seeding rates because you'll get more seed to germinate under that scenario. The row crop planters also can be faster because they can tend to be a lot wider than a drill. So you can cover more ground quickly, so that's an advantage as well. They're typically on 30-inch rows. There are some that have 15-inch rows. 30-inch rows is probably not going to get you the cover crop coverage that you need for your benefits. It's not going to give you canopy closure if you're looking for things like weed suppression. And you really may need to take 2 passes with a 30-inch planter so you can get them on 15-inch rows so that you can get better benefits from the placement of your cover crop in the field. That's why a lot of times people prefer a drill, because you're down to 7.5-inch spacing. That gives you much closer spacing on your cover crops to generate those benefits. The other thing that was already brought up is that the planter is more precise, and therefore you can lower your seeding rates. So that would have an impact on cost. And the other thing to keep in mind that planters have expensive disc openers and other parts that may need to be replaced more often than the wear parts on a drill. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. Advantages, disadvantages in all these planting methods depends on your particular situation. Another option that's becoming more popular is to combine the planting of cover crops with other field operations, such as vertical tillage tools. Many of the vertical tillage companies have created equipment options that allow you to mount cover crop seeding equipment on the vertical till equipment. They're all pretty much standard on the approach. They have an air blower unit and the seed distribution tubes on top of the vertical till frame. Most have the seed broadcast in front of the tillage unit, but a few do have it in the back. Broadcasting the seed in front of a vertical till unit can work well for cover crop seed that can tolerate being 1 inch or more deep, such as cereal rye, triticale, winter wheat, oats, or Austrian winter peas. However, this method can end up planting some types of cover crops too deeply, things like radishes, rapeseed, clovers, other small seeds. They'll generally do better at about 1/2 inch of depth or less. Those may provide a case for broadcasting the seed at the back of the vertical till unit. You know, we look at the use of cover crop seeder with vertical tillage tool might be at conflicting odds, since the ideal system is to combine cover crops and no-till. However, the fact is many farmers are not ready to give up at least a modest amount of tillage, such as running a single vertical tillage pass, which does still leave a fair amount of residue intact. Applying a cover crop seed in the same pass as tillage action that would be done anyway, that makes seeding your cover crops much more affordable and time efficient for the producer. So this is an option that can be considered. There's a variety of cover crop seeders now available. Cover crop seeders are being offered with a wide range of fall tillage equipment, not just vertical till tools. Here are 2 more examples. There's a drill till unit from Horsch and a rolling harrow from Univerfirth. But you'll see many other types of combinations out there where the cover crop seeding equipment is added to a toolbar of some type of other operation, and that really improves the efficiency of getting the cover crop on. Really, every day counts with fall cover crop seeding. This is a video from Steve Groff in Pennsylvania. And the thing to note in this video is they're seeding cover crops, and you can see that they still have standing corn. So Steve is not just waiting for everything to be harvested and then going to go out and seed his cover crops. He realizes the importance of getting the cover crop in early. So when the corn's off, and if he's got the time, he's planting cover crops before he harvests the next round. When we talk about everyday counts, cover crops are like any other crop. Not only do you have to have adequate moisture, but you got to have adequate heat. And as we get later and later in the fall, there's less and less heat units available. In late fall, many potential cover crops are slow to emerge and may get little visible growth. Also, winter survival of cover crops is often dictated by the planting date. This is a picture also from Steve Groff, and you can see on the left, the cover crop was planted October 7th, and on the right, it was planted on September 29th. That's just a little over a week difference. And when this picture was taken on November 11th, you can see there's substantial difference between the amount of cover crop growth. Cover crops that need to be planted early include most of the brassicas, like radishes, turnips, rapeseed and canola, kale. Legumes like clovers, vetches, Austrian winter pea can be planted more mid-fall, but will get much better fall growth if planted in early fall. The cereal grasses can be planted the latest, particularly rye. But even with those species, if you can get them in earlier, you'll get a lot more fall growth, a lot more fall protection from those cover crops. So that's why a lot of farmers are starting to consider things like interseeding, getting them in before the crop is harvested, just so they can get that little bit extra growth. Even a difference of a week can make a big difference in fall establishment, as this photo shows. There's a lot of innovative things kind of going on out there. This is a unit that allows you to seed cover crops while you're harvesting your cash crop. It mounts to the combine head, and it has air delivery tubes, and it's delivering the cover crops below the head, and that gets the seed in contact with the ground before the residue is put on top of it out the back of the combine. Again, this is another way to combine another operation to help with the cost of cover crop seeding. These units work pretty good, but there are some downsides because farmers have commented that slowing down the harvest process to stop and fill the cover crop seeder is not very desirable. And that, when you look at the size of that hopper, that's not a very big hopper on there. So you really have to consider the size of the seed that you're using with this technique. It works better with things that have low seeding rates, really small seeds like radishes or rapeseed, maybe even some clovers. But when you start getting into middle to large size seeds like oats or cereal rye, things that are up around 50 pounds per acre, you're going to be stopping your harvest a lot to fill that hopper. So that's one of the things to keep in mind with this method. One of the innovations among manufacturers are high clearance spraying equipment such as Hagie. Here is to modify their sprayers to instead broadcast cover crop seeds. The spray tank is replaced with a seed box, and an air unit blows the cover crop seed out through the tubes on the spray boom to the drop nozzles, where the seed hits some diverters that broadcast the seed into the corn stand. This has got some advantages over aerial seeding because you're getting that seed down into the canopy, so you don't get near as much canopy loss. And it allows you to do smaller fields where it might not be practical to hire someone to aerial seed those. Hagie calls this their cover crop interseeder, and they claim they can seed up to 500 acres per day. But that really depends on the field size and the seed loading arrangements. Other manufacturers have similar units, and some farmers have custom modified their own spray units to make them into cover crop seeders. So I always say farmers are probably as innovative as anybody about how to create equipment that fits into their systems. Aerial seeding is another option, but there are some tips for being successful with aerial seeding. You want to be careful with the timing. You want to wait until the cash crop is turning color. That's when the canopy is starting to open up, and you're going to get much better distribution within the field of that cover crop seed. Seed type, again, is important. Small seeds are better because you're not going to be incorporating it if you're aerial seeding, most likely. So if that's the case, again, the bigger seeds sitting on top of the ground do not perform as well as smaller seeds. And you really want to find a pilot who has done aerial cover crop seeding. There's a lot of things that you need to keep in mind, and tricks and things that they've learned. So check out your pilots, make sure that they have done cover crop seeding. There are some options for planting midsummer. These are in that period where you would be interseeding. So, for example, interseeding cover crops into knee-high corn, that can give them an early start. But you really need to take a look at your herbicide program if you're going to do this. Herbicide carryover can affect your cover crop planting when you're planting that close to your original planting, and your burn downs and other herbicide treatments. And the last thing you need to do is have your cover crop die because of herbicide carryover. So if you're going to consider interseeding into standing crops, make sure you check your herbicide program. Couple pictures here that show the unit that is from intercedertech.com. This company was developed by Penn State University faculty who collaborated to develop a high clearance drill modified to be driven over corn at up to V7 stage. And it could be used for other row crops too. But basically, this is just a drill that's been lifted up so that the seed hopper can get over top of the corn and still have drill units that are going into the soil. This particular drill is available in a couple of different widths, and it's called a 3-in-1 because you can do up to 3 things at once in one pass with this. You can seed covers, you can apply liquid nitrogen, and you can also spray for weeds. This approach has been more popular in the northern corn belt and southern, especially in northeast corn belt. Its success relies on having enough rainfall to support the small cover crop seedlings, which otherwise are going to struggle. They're not getting a lot of light, and then if you're not getting moisture too, and plus you've got all that competition from the much larger corn crop. Other keys to success with this approach are adjusting the herbicide program to allow use of relevant cover crop. Selecting an appropriate cover crop species or mix that can tolerate shade, and make sure that it can work with the herbicides being applied. Annual ryegrass is one of the better shade tolerant options. Some of the clovers seem to work adequately as well, but you probably want to experiment with what cover crops work for your local conditions. This is a viable way to get cover crops a much earlier start than drilling after harvest. And the earlier you can get them started, the better chance you have of having establishment that's going to make it through the winter. As I talked about before, you want to avoid residual herbicide issues whenever you're planting cover crops. Those herbicides can have a big impact on success in getting cover crops established. You really need to plan ahead when you're looking at your herbicide plan. You also want to consider your cover crop plan. Cereal rye is tolerant of most residual herbicides. Brassicas, though, can be a problem. Things like radish and turnip, rapeseed, they tend to be the most sensitive, and they can particularly be sensitive to herbicides that have broadleaf activity. Keep in mind when you're looking at the effect of residual herbicides that weather conditions can have a big impact on how long they persist. So you may have to make some adjustments later if the weather conditions are not such that the residual effect has passed. So one of the goals is getting winter annual cover crops to survive the winter. If that is the goal, you want to plant in a timely fashion. Some cover crops must be in by early fall to have a chance of surviving the winter. You want to match the cover crop to the soil. There are some species that are less tolerant of poorly drained conditions, in particular brassicas and some clovers. Seeding rate can impact survival, especially with the brassicas. Don't overseed brassicas. They can actually compete with themselves and limit the growth of plants that are really close together. And having some residue cover or a companion crop can also help protect some of the less hardy species and help them survive. That's why we like some of the mixtures like oats with clover. That gives you the best of both worlds. That gives you a couple of good cover crops, but it also gives you a companion crop for your clover. If you're just getting started with cover crops, we like to recommend that cereal rye be planted before soybeans. It's a good first step for most Midwestern farmers considering cover crops. The cereal rye can provide many benefits and works very well in combination with soybeans. There's generally enough time to get the rye planted after corn harvest. While drilling the rye is preferable, many farmers have gotten good stands using other methods such as broadcasting with incorporation, aerial seeding, including it in a fertilizer spreader, or the vertical till tools that we talked about. Rye can be terminated early before the beans, or the soybeans can be planted green into the still living rye, and then the rye can be terminated with herbicides or with a roller crimper if you happen to be organic. The Midwest Cover Crop Council has a simple 2 to 3 page recipe guide on getting started with cover crops for each of the Midwestern states, and all of them recommend cereal rye before soybeans. The guides contain seeding rate and method recommendations and tips on termination and other management. If you'd like to check those out, you can go to the Midwest Cover Crop Council website, mccc.msu.edu. Go to the Getting Started tab, and you'll find a tab for cover crop recipes under that tab. Check it out and see if it's something that might be for you. So in summary, on establishing cover crops, getting the cover crop seed established at the appropriate time is key to getting the optimum benefits from the cover crop and increasing the likelihood of winter survival. Cover crops that are not as winter hardy, if they're established too late, even though they could have gotten through the winter if they had gotten better establishment and gotten bigger, they may not make it if they don't reach the right growth stage. So get them in at the appropriate time for that cover crop. Successful establishment depends on good seed soil contact and the cover crop seeds receiving adequate moisture, either from being planted down into existing soil moisture or receiving timely rainfall or being irrigated. That wasn't talked about before, but if you have irrigation, consider watering in your cover crops. It's a good way to really benefit the cover crop establishment. Seeding the cover crop before harvest of the cash crop is increasingly an option for many farmers, something that you might want to consider. And if you're short on time, you might want to hire an ag retailer, aerial applicator, or maybe even a neighboring or retired farmer to do the seeding for you. That can help you with the time crunch that you might experience, particularly late in the season. So with that, That's the end of what I have to present, and I think we're going to wait until the very end to do questions. So I am going to give it back to Anna.
All right, thanks, Dean. Yeah, just in the interest of time, if folks need to leave right at the hour mark, we want to make sure and get both presentations in. So I'm going to ask Gatlin Bunton to share his screen. He's with University of Missouri, and he's going to talk with us about cover crop termination. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Gatlin.
All righty, let me get this pulled up.
All right. And I'll have the CEU link in the chat after Gatlin's finished, and then we'll have some, 15 or 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So go ahead and put those questions in the chat, and then that way we'll make sure and get to them. All right. Thanks again, Gatlin.
All righty. Okay, so now we'll go through the cover crop termination portion of this. Again, we were developed by Dr. Rob Myers, Dr. Eileen Kladivko, and Dr. Paul Jossa, and funding is provided by the Walton Family Foundation. So cover crop termination, we've got a lot of different approaches. Some of those are pretty simple, utilizing winter kill. Others involve herbicides or mechanical means like roller crimpers or mowing, or grazing using livestock, or even tillage. So to get right into it, our termination with cold weather, so that would be our winter kill. This is going to be really important if we're using this, is to find species that will reliably winter kill. So some of those might be our warm season crops. So if we're thinking about a system that we can utilize those, our warm season crops usually are going to kill out around freezing. Some of them might be a little bit lower than that, but most winters we will usually get below that. So some examples of those would be sun hemp, cowpeas, millets, sunflowers. Those are all going to reliably winter kill. Our cool season crops, we have some that will, some that won't. So the ones that will, those are the ones that aren't very winter hardy, and temperature is going to be really dependent on these. Some are going to kill out at higher temperatures than others. Some, like we just talked about, are going to kill out more readily. If they're planted too thickly, they're less likely to overwinter. But choosing the ones that work for you in your location are going to be really important. So spring oats, those are usually killed at about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter oats are a little bit lower at about 14 degrees, and radishes around 20. And these other ones we have listed here are potentially going to winter kill, depending on the variety and planting rate. Our cool season annuals, like we see here, it's important to think about those as we're letting winter work for us. So for the first time farmer that's trying to get into cover crops, this can be a good way to get started for them, just because we don't have to worry as much about controlling these in the spring. But in an area that may not get colder than 20 to 25 degrees, we're still going to potentially have a lot of these over winter. If we have a place where the winter reliably gets down into the single digits, usually we can rely on these to winter kill. So again, all these temperatures are just kind of averages, but there's some things that can change here. If we have snow cover, that might allow these to overwinter a little bit better. If we have sudden drops in temperatures, that might kill them off a little bit quicker. But again, these can be a good starting place for that first time cover crop user. So termination with herbicides. For non-organic row crop production, most cover crops that overwinter are going to be terminated with herbicides. Many grain farmers are already going to use a burn down application, and we can use this to kill a lot of our cover crops as well. We may have to adapt and start including some other things into our tank mix. For example, if we're using our cereal grains as a cover crop, glyphosate works very well. However, if we're adding other things into that mix, like legumes, we may have to add 2,4-D or some other broadleaf killer. The important things to remember is that we need to have that cover crop actively growing. If it's dormant, this herbicide application isn't going to do much for control of these. and we need to consider our soil moisture conditions when we decide to terminate. If the spring is tending dry, we may terminate a little bit earlier just so we're not misusing some of that soil moisture. If it looks like we're going to be wet, we might go a little bit longer, let those get a little more growth on them just so that they are using some of that soil moisture. If we're working with a cover crop mix, we need to be paying attention to timing. Some things are going to mature a little quicker, some things a little later, and that could lead us to use different herbicide choices. So these are all tips from Dr. Kevin Bradley at the University of Missouri, and these are some species-specific herbicide recommendations. With a lot of these, they're going to be pretty similar, but we can see we have a few other herbicides thrown into the mix for some of our species. So something like cereal rye, again, very common, one of the first ones that a lot of people go to. Glyphosate plus sharpen, or with select, which is clethodim, is a very effective means to terminate them. The same for winter wheat, another small grain. Glyphosate plus select is very effective. Things like annual ryegrass, that one, glyphosate plus select is going to be the best way to kill it, but there's some special things we need to keep in mind. We can develop resistance in our annual ryegrass populations, so we want to avoid that. And some ways to do that is spray when our daytime temperature is above 55 degrees. We can get higher than that. 60 or higher is going to be optimum. Wait until your annual ryegrass is actively growing. Again, if we're putting something on in a dormant cover crop, it's not going to do much good anyway, but we need to wait for 5 to 7 days after they've begun actively growing for best results. And then if our nighttime temperatures drop below 38, we need to wait another 3 days before spraying, just because there's that risk that they're not going to be actively growing. If we're going to spray, we need to spray at least 4 hours before sunset, and this will allow maximum translocation of the glyphosate that we're using within the plant. So that's going to let it move around and begin to work in multiple areas. So if we're going to include a legume like hairy vetch, then Liberty or Germoxone, or using glyphosate with a broadleaf product is a good option. So again, relying on more than just that glyphosate. Same with Austrian winter pea, glyphosate plus sharpen tends to work pretty well. So if we're going to use mechanical termination, we've got a couple different options. Roller crimping, like we see here, is an option. Mowing or even tillage as a last option can work for us. For our roller crimpers or mowers, generally we're going to terminate a cover crop more effectively if the plants have already begun flowering. So vegetative growth, we can think of that like mowing a lawn. You can mow it, you can crimp it, but it's probably going to grow right back. So roller crimpers, those are going to have some sort of metal vein on them to help you break and crimp the stem. Plain rollers may work, but not reliably. We've got these veins. It's going to have a steel edge that's going to crush or break the vascular tissues, that xylem and the phloem within the plant. Again, works best if it's already reached the reproductive stage. So once it started to flower or develop a head, and it's often better to roll after planting. That way we're not worried about having a mat we're trying to plant through. If we're rolling before planting, it's important to roll in the same direction that we're going to plant. So that way we're not pushing this rolled mat back up as the planter is moving along. If there's a lot of biomass, the stems on the bottom of a roll layer may not be as crimped as well as those on the top. So that may necessitate going over twice just so we get a good crimp on that and a good kill. There's a lot of options with our roller crimpers. There's dozens of manufacturers are now making these. Some of our single rollers are going to be smaller, 10 to 15 feet wide. Those can take a lot of time, but they're usually just as effective. We do have folding rollers that allow us to make more progress in a single pass. And we now even have smaller roller crimpers that can be added to the toolbar of a planter like we see here on the right. So in the last decade, we've made a lot of progress with these. If we're just getting started in this, our single rollers can be a good way to start. Usually those are priced pretty reasonably, but again, we're not going to cover a whole lot of ground. An important thing to remember is we have options for where and how we're mounting. So We can have front rollers or rear mounted rollers. If we were equipped for a front roller, that's going to work pretty well for us, just because we are going to roll everything in front of the tires. That way we're not accidentally pushing something down with the tires that may not get crimped. If we have a front roller, it's also an option for us to run the planter right behind us. That way we have planting and rolling all done in one pass. If we do have a rear roller, we can still have that one pass system. We just have to be able to pull the roller behind the planter. Mowing is another way that we can terminate. Successful termination here is really dependent on timing. So again, we need to be at flowering. I can't drive that home enough. If we get it while we're in the vegetative stage, so pre-flowering, it's often going to regrow. We have to get below that growing point, and on something like a grass, that's pretty hard to do. Mow as close to the ground as you can, even if we have reached that reproductive growth stage. And remember that the type of mower we're using can make a difference. We've got flail mowers. That's going to cut up our residue more finely, takes more power, and not all of us have that equipment. If we have something like a brush hog or, our rotary mowers, a lot of us have these available to us. They're inexpensive, they're durable, and these can be an easy way to get started when we're thinking of mowing our cover crops for termination. Sickle bars can be used if that's what you have. And that may be a good option for a very tall cover crop, but it's more likely to tangle up with some of our legumes. So here we can see an example of mowing versus crimping. On the left, we have crimping. On the right, we have mowing. So this really shows us that they aren't doing the same thing. So on the left, our sorghum Sudan grass here was terminated by that roller crimper, and we see that it has left more residue evenly distributed on the ground. So we're getting a lot more soil coverage, which could help with weed control. We look to the mowed section, we see that we have a lot less even distribute. The cover crop is not as evenly distributed, and we see that we've got some areas that have a little bit of bare ground showing. Obviously, our weed control won't be as good, and our decomposition might be a little bit slower just because we don't have as solid of a mat to start decomposing there. Grazing is another option to terminate. The basic idea here is we are just simulating mowing. So we are using livestock to mow that crop down. And with the same with mechanical mowing, timing is pretty critical. It works best if it's already flowering. Our plants need to be grazed very hard. So this is going to necessitate that we are rotationally grazing these things, or we're using an ultra high stocking rate, such as we see here. So using a poly wire, moving that, giving the animals a smaller amount and forcing them to eat it all is the way that we're going to do this. The thing is, we need to avoid trampling. So that's why we need to have these ultra high stocking densities. That way they are forced to eat it, not necessarily walk it into the ground. If they trample it, we haven't disrupted that plant enough, it could regrow. So tillage. We should generally avoid this, especially if we're already in a no-till or a strip-till system. This has been very common in the past. It's still used by some organic producers. In the past, we would plant our cover crop, let it grow, plow it in, and this was called green manuring. We've been doing that for centuries, but this is not going to be the best for our soil health or really give us the benefits that we would have, erosion-wise from using that cover crop. If we are going to till, though, we need to make sure we dislodge the roots of the cover crop. That way we ensure complete termination. This might be warranted in areas where we have pest issues, so voles or slugs. Light tillage might be useful to break up their pest cycle. And our tillage termination is going to be really common in organic production or for some sort of horticultural operations. So some of our more specialized production is going to use this. Now we'll transition from termination methods to termination timing. So timing is very critical on most of these. If we're going to terminate early, it's got some advantages. The biggest is we're minimizing the amount of cover crop residue that we have to deal with when we're planting our cash crop. So for someone that is just getting started with cover crops, this can be a good way to go for them. It's a little more comfortable. This can reduce the chance of some of our pest problems. It can prevent the soil from being dried out by the cover crop. So if we're in an area where soil moisture is an issue, or we have drought conditions starting, that's something to keep in mind. A caution though, if we're going to terminate a high biomass cover crop about 2 weeks before the cash crop planting, that's going to end up making a wet mat that's unlikely to dry out before planting. So using an early termination on this can be a way to go. If we're going to terminate late, so including that planting green planting strategy, it's got some advantages as well. It allows the cover crop to grow longer, which maximizes our cover crop benefits for soil, organic matter, erosion reduction, weed control, a lot of different things. That longer period of cover crop growth can help draw down soil moisture in a wet spring, which may enable us to plant earlier. And sometimes planting into a still standing and living cover crop, so that planting green is easier than a thick mat of dead cover crop residue. If we think about that previous slide with our sorghum Sudan grass, it'd be pretty hard to plant through. A caution on this one, if our spring conditions are trending dry, it's probably best to go ahead and terminate the cover crop earlier, just so we avoid drying out that soil. But as springs are getting wetter in some areas, this can be a good option to let us still get in there and plant our cash crop. So in summary, we're going to use herbicides to terminate a cover crop. We need to match the herbicide choice to the species of cover crops that we're being sprayed. Make sure that we're putting down an effective spray to kill what we've planted to terminate them. If a farmer is seeking to minimize or eliminate herbicides, mechanical termination options are available. You have to pay more attention to growth stage of the cover crop. So if we're using a crimper, using a mower, we have to rely on that reproductive growth stage to make sure we get good control. For first-time cover crop users, sometimes cover crops that terminate in the winter, that winter kill, you're going to get an easier way to get started in that. It's going to be a little more comfortable way of trying those out. For an overwintering cover crop, early termination may be an easy strategy for the novice. So if we're using something like a cereal rye that's going to overwinter, then that may be the easiest way before we start planting maybe an early cash crop, like an early planting of corn. For more experienced cover crop users, there can be advantages to delayed cover crop termination, including planting green. We can see the advantages to allowing that cover crop to grow fully. We can see better weed control, better soil health as well. With that, I am finished here. I'll turn it back over to Anna.
All right, thanks again. I have just put the link to our short survey and the CEU QR code in the chat. So if you're looking for CEUs, please check that out. And if you have any questions, you can unmute and ask, or just type them out in the chat. The first one we've got is for Dean, based on seeding. What type of difference would you recommend between drilled seeding and broadcast as far as seeding rates?
Well, that kind of varies around the country and with opinions as well, I think. But we tend, here in Michigan, we tend to recommend about a 10% increase for broadcast seeding with incorporation versus drilling. Now, if you're not incorporating, you really need to look at that very similar to aerial seeding. And in a lot of cases, in Michigan, we recommend upping it by about 25% for that. In general, though, I think you need to look at your field conditions. If you have more residue and you're broadcasting, you probably are going to want to take it up. You may even want to take it up a little bit more, just because that's what's going to get you is the residue and the rough soil surface is going to keep that from getting good seed soil contact. So you are going to lose some seed to predation. Some of them is just not going to germinate. So kind of in that, be looking in that 10% up to 25% range.
Thanks, Dean. We've had a couple of comments related to tillage versus herbicide and which is less detrimental environmentally. We know tillage causes a lot of problems downstream. A lot of sediment entering the waterways and that kind of thing. I think it's important to remember as we're talking about terminating cover crops that there will almost definitely be a spring burn down whether we have cover crops planted or not. And so that herbicide is not actually additional herbicide that we're using to terminate cover crops, but would likely be used regardless. And so I think there's a benefit environmentally to having those cover crops there to absorb those herbicides and keep them off of bare ground. I don't know if Gatlin, if you have anything additional to add to that. You've got more herbicide experience than I do.
Yeah, so one thing to remember is that we do have the potential for a little more absorption into that cover crop residue or into that living cover crop that is going to eliminate some of our leaching and other things like that. So we're probably going to be putting down that herbicide anyway or a burn down. So if we can have that cover crop out there and have it absorb a little bit, that can be a good way to help mitigate some of those off target movements with it. So still using it, it's probably going to be used anyway. So using it to our advantage to help control our cover crop, I think is still going to be beneficial for us.
Trade-offs to both for sure. It's something to consider.
I have a follow-up comment. I asked a question about the impact between, if we know which is the least detrimental to the environment in general beyond soil health, between tillage and herbicide. And I think you made the argument that herbicide will be used no matter what. And I can say something similar was the tillage, is that maybe we were not going to till if we didn't have a cover crop, but also maybe the impact of tillage on the cover crop as opposed to tillage on bare ground are two very different things. And the impact of tillage on a cover crop is much, much less detrimental and actually can be potentially beneficial compared to tillage on bare ground. There are actually a lot of studies coming out now saying that one can achieve optimal soil health with a cover crop and tillage in their systems.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience or research experience in terms of what's ideal. Definitely, tillage is going to be, less detrimental if we've got that cover crop there. So some good things to bring up, and definitely, I think we all want to learn more about, how we can better manage all of these systems and reduce environmental impacts, either way, whatever your method is. I think those are some great points. Dean or Gatlin, you have any follow-up on that one? I know we've got another question in the chat. I don't want to rush through this, but want to get to all the questions.
No, I mean, I agree with what you just said. I think a lot of this stuff is we have to balance. We have to look at the balance, and the amount of tillage it takes, light tillage is not going to have as much effect as, pulling out the moldboard plow. So there's degrees within that. I think a lot of times light tillage could be used to terminate a cover crop. Might need some multiple passes, and it's probably not going to be as detrimental as that deep tillage would be to soil health and to the environment, as long as it's all about keeping the residue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We also had a question about my screen moved, about terminating cereal rye about 10 days before corn planting. And I know there's still a lot of work being done on this, but I don't know if either one of you want to speak to your termination timing of cereal rye or those winter cereals ahead of corn, and what kind of impacts that has.
Well, I can,
Well,
oh, go ahead.
I'll give you the weed science side of it. There's a lot of research is still ongoing on, you know, how early we need to be terminating a rye crop before corn. We've got the research on soybean pretty well nailed down from the weed science side of things, but we don't have a lot of good answers on corn yet. So, Dean, you might have a little better answer.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, the whole problem is we don't understand the mechanism that causes the yield hit. It's not consistent year to year and under conditions. And so we tell people just don't mess with it. Terminate 10 days, 2 weeks prior. The studies, there have been some big studies that have tried to identify what's actually causing it and have not been able to get anything to correlate real well to that yield hit. And it happens infrequently, but when it happens, it's a big yield hit. So it's really not worth messing with. Either terminate 2 weeks or a week to 2 weeks ahead of planting, or terminate after planting, just to avoid the potential of that happening. I've had farmers get away with terminating much closer when they've had no choice, but you know, it's kind of the luck of the draw. You might not get lucky the next time you try it.
We've got another weed management question here. So in an organic system where high residue hasn't been achieved with a cover crop, what would you use for in-season weed control? You know, you may have a cover crop mat between the rows, but not enough to control weeds. Wouldn't a tine weeder get caught up in that residue? Any ideas on that in an organic system? Oh, that's a tough question.
So, Dean, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll give you my opinion. I think you really have to pick which way you're going to go. If you want the mat and you're going to do the roller crimping type option, you need to have a really good stand of cereal rye. You have to have a really good mat, and that should help you. If you're not going to do that, then you're going to need to be able to get through there with tine weeders and cultivators and things like that. Because if you have any gaps in that mat, you're going to have weeds. That's just kind of the way it works. And so you have to really commit, and you have to make sure that you really do have the stand of cereal rye that you can generate that good mat that gives you total ground coverage if you're going to rely on that method. That's, you know, go one way or the other. You can't go in the middle.
Yeah, kind of to echo that mat is super important. Some research that's ongoing at the University of Missouri is looking at hooded sprays, you know, using our clove oils and a few other organic spray products, and that's tending to look a little bit better than trying to follow it up with some sort of tine weeder or something like that.
Okay, got some good discussion going on in the chat. Any other questions? This one's gone pretty quick this morning.
Has anybody looked at the competition factors with middle mat of cover crop to the crop? Do any of you have comments on that?
You mean like a kind of mid-level biomass for the mat? Is that your question?
Yeah, if you have a mat in the middle and you want to keep it there as long as possible for weed management and water soil conservation, what's the, are there any guidelines to assist with decisions if it's causing more competition to your crop, your main crop, than contributions to your soil?
I think getting it knocked down is a big issue. I don't know if Dean or Gatlin know of any research out there.
No, I mean, you got to get the mat killed. And if you can get it killed and laid down good, I don't, and then it just depending on the carbon nitrogen ratio and the amount of nitrogen of the cover crop, and then the amount of nitrogen available in the soil, you may see varying, it may decompose quicker in some systems than others, but you should get, well into the season with your weed control on it. And I don't see it. It shouldn't compete with if you get it killed, it shouldn't compete with the cash crop. I hope I understood the question correctly there, Vicki.
I guess I was looking more like at a ridge till system where you keep the cover crop alive for as long as.
Oh, I don't have experience with that one.
Okay. Any other questions, or there's a good chance that something came through the chat that I missed. So if there's something you want to bring up, please go ahead and type it in the chat or unmute. All right. Well, thank you again to Dean and Gatlin.